Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Drake. We are going to move on from Mesopotamia and Egypt and talk about another Asian ancient civilization, that being the Indus Valley civilization. By the time you've watched this video, you should be able to tell the difference between the different geographic features of what we call the Indian subcontinent, and you should also be able to explain why we call it the subcontinent. You should be able to explain the importance of monsoons to that region and describe the very important ancient cities of Harappa and Mohenjo Daro. Also be able to define or identify these geographic terms: the Deccan Plateau, the Himalayas, monsoons, and the Khyber Pass. Before we talk about the civilizations, let's go a little bit into the geography of the Indian subcontinent. It is actually not all just modern-day India. The Indian subcontinent also includes the modern country of Pakistan, which is located on India's northwestern border. And most of the cities, or most of the civilization that we'll talk about here today, the Indus Valley civilization, actually was located in what is today Pakistan. But the Indian subcontinent is very, very isolated from the rest of the continent by mountains. On the northwest is a region known as the Hindu Kush that isolated it from Mesopotamia and what we would now call the Middle East. And in the northeast was the Himalayan mountains, most famous for Mount Everest, but of course that is the tallest mountain range in the world. And in addition to the mountains, India had two other very, very notable geographic features. One would be the coastal plains, or the Ghats, that are located along the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. That is very flat, low-lying area. And then the Deccan Plateau, the triangular plateau located in the middle of the country. The rivers that came out of the mountains carried melted snow with them, which was very important to the cultivation of crops, which made civilization possible in those regions. The most important meteorological factor in ancient India, and in India today for that matter, are the monsoons. And a lot of times in our society we associate monsoons with torrential downpours, but that's actually not exactly correct. Monsoons are the winds that carry rain with them. In the winter, the monsoons are dry, though, and they flow from the northeast, like what we would now call China, southwest across India towards the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. And that withers the crops and keeps everything dry. Then in the spring and the summer, the monsoons come the opposite direction. They come off of the Arabian Sea, northeast across the subcontinent, going towards China. And it leads to rain almost every single day that just completely drenches the land. And as a result, the crops are able to grow. But the monsoons are finicky, which has at times caused problems for people living on the Indian subcontinent. If the monsoons are not as wet as normal, you may have famine, which is a major disaster. Or if the monsoons are too heavy, you may have disastrous flooding. So it doesn't always work out to the optimal result, but the monsoons are very important in allowing a lot of Indian civilization to flourish over the centuries. So now we'll talk a little bit about the people who lived in this ancient civilization along the Indus River. The cities that were discovered are known today as Harappa and Mohenjo Daro, but those names are actually less than 100 years old. These civilizations were totally forgotten for almost 4,000 years and were accidentally discovered by archaeologists in 1922. And there have been plenty of artifacts found that give us some glimpses into the way they probably lived, but nothing else is really known. We don't know the names of any kings or queens. We haven't found any tax records. There's virtually nothing. But as we've talked about in this class, sometimes historians just have to make educated guesses. And in the case of the Indus civilizations, that's what historians and archaeologists have done. So what we know for sure is that the cities were very, very large, especially by the standard of ancient civilizations. We also know that the civilization and these cities just completely went up in smoke and vanished without a trace about 2,500 years ago. Again, to be completely forgotten until very recently, within the last century. The cities were very, very elaborate, especially for their time. They had sewage systems. Houses had drains and plumbing that ran underneath them, essentially. The bricks were identical in size, which leads us to believe that uh, there was some kind of manufacturing, standard in place, and the city was very well laid out in very precise, large city blocks. So this leads us to believe they had a very good government, which we'll talk about in just a second. But again, in terms of their culture or their history or warfare, or whatever, we know absolutely nothing. Now, what we think we know based on artifacts is they were polytheistic. There were statues and idols found that seemed to worship many different beings. They appear to have worshipped bulls, which would make sense considering the sacred place that cows hold in India today. There were also large buildings at the center of cities that logic would say they're temples. We believe they probably had a strong government because the buildings all looked the same. The city appeared to be very well laid out. So, we think that everything was run very, very well in those cities, and they were very, very efficient. And because the cities are laid out so precisely, with very precise measurements, we believe they were probably pretty good at math. It's also hypothesized they traded with Mesopotamian civilizations because artifacts that appear to be from the Middle East have been found within Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Now, as for what actually happened to the Indus Valley civilizations, again, we don't actually know for sure. The hypothesis is they were invaded by a group called the Aryans, who came in from the northwest through the Hindu Kush. The Khyber Pass is a very notable geographic feature in India. It is a mountain pass between Pakistan and India that brings you into the subcontinent. So the Aryans most likely came through the Khyber Pass and sacked the cities we now know as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Before that, they probably were weakened by something else. There's some evidence that maybe there was an earthquake or a volcanic eruption that nearby that blocked the river, causing floods. We don't know for sure. Once again, but we can make our best guess. So that will do it for today. You'll now work on a map activity for ancient India, and you'll be reading about some of the kingdoms that we do know a good bit more about. That'll do it for today. As always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers.